I'm friends with some of the biggest content creators in the world. And I sat down with them. I'm like, tell me your secret. And they all said the same exact thing. And it was consistency. Consistency being the number one thing to grow your audience. And that's when I realized, I was like, that was my aha moment. I was like, let's just stay consistent. Our first episode we released of Group Chat got 50 downloads. The second episode got 25. We lost half our listeners after 1 week. So off to a slow start. It wasn't till a year later did we realize we had built a real audience. And then it slowly scaled from there.
This Audience Summit is brought to you in partnership with Podcast Notes, the best ideas from the world's best podcasts in minutes.
Dee, welcome to the Grow Your Podcast Audience Summit, brought to you by the Lewis and Kyle Show. We're excited to have you on as a contributor.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Real quick, for those who aren't familiar with yourself and your show, could you give a little personal background, talk a bit about your podcast, the when and why it got started, and kind of the overall mission?
Yeah, so I'm the CEO of the 5-4 Group. We are a portfolio of about a dozen or so brands, predominantly in fashion, in the direct-to-consumer space. We've been around 18 years. And about 3 years ago, I started thinking about customer acquisition cost as like my biggest challenge. So if you have an e-commerce business, getting a new customer through your door is the most expensive thing on your P&L outside of whatever you're selling. And ours was nearly $2 million a month we were spending on acquiring customers. So I was like, this seems like an asinine amount of money. I need to figure out how to lower this budget. So I started going through all these different things. Predominantly our budget was in Facebook. And then I tried television, I tried podcasts, I tried search, I tried influencers. And I landed on this idea of me becoming famous as the way to lower my customer acquisition costs. So I said, imagine if I had spent all this time and money just becoming the most famous entrepreneur in the world, I would be acquiring customers a lot cheaper. And so I was like, how do I become famous? So I thought about everything. I started a vlog. No one cares what, at that time, a 37-year-old Indian father is doing. I started thinking about, all my famous friends. How do I use them to help me get famous? And then I stumbled on the idea of a podcast because my partner in one of our brands, Young and Reckless, we had encouraged him to do one, and he started getting a pretty good following with his podcast, Short Story Long. And he was like, I think podcast also could be good for you. You have a very unique perspective and take on a lot of things that people are interested in, and from the LA perspective. So one day, he would come to my office every single day, sit on my couch and talk about the world. We would talk about finance, we talk about tech, we talk about fashion, politics. And I was like, this should be the podcast. This is like what everyone's talking about, a group chat in their own world. So we started doing that 3 years ago. And my sole goal with the podcast was to get enough of a following to lower my customer acquisition cost. And it's still my goal to this day. And that's why I started it.
Well, that's a extremely interesting backstory. And I'm really grateful for you sharing that whole context. It's strategic and super interesting. So now I'm kind of curious about diving into the how of the actual podcast. So what has been for you the most effective marketing channel for growing the audience through the podcast, and how have you used it?
So I think using your listeners is the most powerful way to grow your podcast. So podcasts have an enormous amount of friction. If you ask the average American, how do you listen to a podcast? They probably don't know. They couldn't find the app on their phone. And it's about word of mouth. Like you guys discovered our podcast because your friend told you, and her friend told her, and so on and so forth. So your listener has to be your evangelist to really grow your audience. There's no like growth hack, in my opinion. So it's about building a rabid fan base. And I think the way you do that is obviously make great content and be extremely consistent. So I knew our podcast was important to the people who listened to it when one day I got so drunk, I didn't want to do the podcast. And I was like, I can't do it today. I'm too hungover. And we just didn't release it. And the next day I got blown up on Instagram. They're like, how the hell do you not have a Monday morning podcast? Like, how did you miss that? And I was like, honestly, I'm hungover. Like, I just didn't do it. And so I knew at that point, I was like, wow, we have we have created a habit amongst our listener. And in order to continue to be reliable to them, you have to be consistent. So when I started this journey of like content and podcast, I started asking. So I'm friends with some of the biggest content creators in the world. And I sat down with them. I'm like, tell me your secret. And they all said the same exact thing. And it was consistency. Consistency being the number one thing to grow your audience. And that's when I realized, I was like, that was my aha moment. I was like, let's just stay consistent. Our first episode we released of Group Chat got 50 downloads. The second episode got 25. We lost half our listeners after 1 week. So off to a slow start. It wasn't till a year later did we realize we had built a real audience. And then it slowly scaled from there.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things to touch on there, and Lewis and I are experiencing something similar, and that's why we're doing this audience summit as a way to find out, what are the ways that people have grown their audience. And our next question for you, I feel like you are not going to like it because you said that there's no tactics, but we're asking everybody, so I'm going to ask you, what are some underrated tactics that you've used to attract listeners to your show?
So I would say the biggest thing that I've done that I think is effective is engage with the audience. And that could be I respond to every single DM I get. And I will wake up after an episode with 500 DMs just in the morning, because all of people in Paris and London and Australia who listen to the podcast will have like an opinion on it. And throughout the day, like if I'm sitting in an Uber or going for a walk or doing something, if I have a free moment, I am responding to every single person. And I have a personal relationship with so many of our listeners. And I think that is how you build ultimate stickiness. So if you love Joe Rogan and you DM him, he's never going to respond, right? So I'm focused on like hyper engagement amongst our core user base. Because what I've learned in building brands is everyone doesn't have to like you, but if you get a group of people that are obsessed with you, that's way more valuable. And so the way you do that is build a relationship. So mine is, if you DM me, I will respond. If you at me on Twitter, I will respond. You want to argue with me, I'll argue with you. And I think that alone has created such a sticky situation, because when something big happens in the world, our audience wants to hear from us. So our biggest downloads ever are election, the day Kobe Bryant died. It was still our biggest day because we're from LA. We grew up in LA. He is like a god to us. And that, what we realize is every time there's something happening in the world, our audience comes to us because they've built that trust within us. So I think the consistency along with the engagement, where like, I know, like I've personally physically met thousands of our listeners. Like I have a run club in LA. It's basically our listeners who show up to this run club every week. So when I say, hey, I'm in New York, anyone want to come run with me? 100 people will show up in New York City and come run with me. Or if I'm in Paris, I'm in London, I'm in Miami, I'm in Atlanta, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, wherever. And so I've used that like meet up thing as like my way of connecting with people. So the best example to use in fashion, you're never going to get to meet Ralph Lauren because he's Ralph Lauren. He's just not going to sit and talk and meet with random people. I've sold millions and millions of units of fashion that many people around the world have worn our clothes. You can easily meet me. I literally tell everyone where I'm at. I walk to work. I run back home. Customers and listeners see me and they stop and pull over all the time and engage with me. So I think the tactic is really like hand-to-hand combat of like, go out and actually connect with who's listening with you.
No, that's fantastic. I'll definitely take you up on that. If I'm in LA, I'd love to go for a run sometime. And that's definitely, again, about observing the patterns from the content creators. I mean, that's something that's come up on almost every single episode of this summit so far. We had Jordan Harbinger on, who actually interviewed Kobe, and his number one tip again, I respond to every DM. I answer every tweet. If people want to reach me, I'll reach them back. And it's just such a true pattern. And it is true also that Joe Rogan doesn't respond because I sent him a DM and he didn't respond. Sample size of one. But I also love, again, what you were saying there about super fans. I think that, 1,000 super fans beats 100,000 not true fans, because 1,000 super fans will eventually become 100,000 super fans if you give it time. So those were some great answers, and I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Of course.
Third question for you, and I guess this one might seem a little redundant. We'll see if you have an additional twist to it, just because you've done a good job hitting so many of the key points here. But what ways would you attribute, how do you think that people have become your super fans? So you've attracted a large audience, but what about your show actually converts just these listeners into those super fans?
So when you think about a podcast ultimately is a form of entertainment or education, or, however you position yourself. But entertainment is probably the right way to think about it. So when we're doing a show, if it's not interesting, if it's not fun, if it's not engaging, then I don't see why people would come back to it daily, right? And so part of it is, I'll say stuff that's on my mind that sparks a reaction. And I think that shock value is important when creating a conversation with your audience. Like, people come up to me all the time and say, I disagree with everything you believe in, but I can't stop listening. And I think that is important, because if you're just echoing whatever else is out in the universe, they don't need you. What unique perspective are you bringing to the conversation? So I'm giving you on our last episode, which was with Ian Rogers, who's the Chief Digital Officer of LVMH. He says, I listen to you guys because you're in a bubble and I want to hear about the bubble. And so that's important. That's a super interesting thing, because if I just play like the politically correct view on every single topic, you can get that somewhere else. I'm not the person to give you that information. I'm going to give you the perspective I see living my life. And I'm okay if you disagree with me. And I'm okay if there's, you are cringing at what I say. But it's important to spark conversation and a reaction. And you can't be boring. That's really what it comes down to. Because like podcasting at the end of the day is entertainment. You're trying to drift that person away from whatever they're doing at the moment to have like some fun while listening to you. It's the same reason why I listen to music. I want an escape. I'm not looking for the music to remind me how stressed I am about work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the point there is like optimizing for controversy is not a bad strategy for audience growth, because, if you say something that the masses agree with, like nobody cares. But if you say something that goes against the grain, it's going to pick up ears more than just like repeating, buzzwords.
And I would say that it's okay to optimize for controversy if that's what you actually believe in, because you have to be authentic to it, right? Like if I say something, I actually believe it and live it. So then if I am caught doing the opposite, then I look like a phony,
Mm-hmm. And I agree with that. Authenticity, I think, is like a it's like a like it's the top of the funnel. You have to have that before you can have anything else.
Exactly.
But the fourth question for you is one of my favorites. It's if you could start your show over again, what would you do differently now to have grown it more effectively?
I'd probably have a shorter format. I would probably have it more highly produced. And I think I would have, I think shorter format's the main thing. Like if we could have been like, if we had been optimizing the whole time for like a 30-minute show, I think that would help scale it.
All righty. Well, last question for you. And I feel a little silly asking this depending on the different types of hosts, because you opened up saying you've in the past had a $2 million acquisition budget on the monthly basis. But if you go back to scrap your days without that kind of budget and you got a $1,000 gift from Lewis and Kyle to attract listeners to your show, what would you do with the money?
I would hire someone to make memes.
Believe it or not, that's not the first time that's been the answer. which is
Yeah.
actually really interesting. So maybe that's officially validated as a good strategy.
Well, yeah, here's the thing. It's like discovery in podcasts is the hardest thing. And it's, for example, I've tested advertising our podcast and I can spend the money, it doesn't convert. So what will actually convert is just people becoming having awareness of your brand, of whatever you're pushing. So I hired a full-time social media person for Instagram for group chat. And I told them, I'm like, just make memes like all day and see if that is better engagement. And maybe they'll discover us because of a meme, start following it, and then they'll eventually realize it's a podcast, and then eventually try the podcast, because it's all about top of funnel discovery. And I think you have to create content from your podcast that will help that discovery. So either or, if you don't have the creative chops to do memes, be extremely thorough on Twitter. I've seen so many people grow incredible Twitter followings with absolutely no money except time.
Those are some great tips. And it's kind of funny you made that point about the importance of Instagram memes. We had Case Kenny, if you've heard of New Mindset Who Dis. And I was like, it's interesting. You're the first podcaster I've ever seen whose podcast Instagram account is way bigger than their personal. Usually it's kind of flipped, right? Where it's like only a small percentage of their fans like it. And he's like, of course it is. My podcast is a meme account. Like those just blow up. And he just like said it like it was the dumbest question ever. And I'm like, it's a good point. So memes are still powerful even in 2020.
I think people don't realize all that matters is reaching as many people as possible. How you do it is irrelevant. So if you have to do TikTok videos to get people to follow you, once you have your audience, you can take them anywhere, but you got to have the audience first.
That's amazing. Well, if anyone listening to this wants to become part of your audience and they're intrigued by your story and your content, where should we send them to keep up with you and your show?
So at Group Chat Pod is our Instagram handle on Instagram. We're available on all podcast platforms under Group Chat. And my personal Instagram is at Dee Murthy, DeeMurthy.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being a part of this project.
Thank you for having me. Go Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
Thank you so much for watching this interview. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to our channel right here on YouTube. And if you feel like you learned something, share this episode on social media to help us grow our audience as well.